This week on the podcast, we had a long, insightful conversation with special guest Alex Matchneer. We had some audio issues, so for the first 27 minutes of the talk, we're using backup audio. But you should definitely listen to the full interview because Alex drops some serious knowledge throughout our talk. Alex's company is also hiring, so we're going to start with a quick word about that and then get right into the interview. I hope you enjoy the podcast.
So I work at a company, startup that's about 4 or 5 years old at this point called Futureproof Retail, and we are hiring. We're looking for more senior level developers with Ember and Rails experience. We are doing lots of exciting things. Our main product is a app that lets you use your phone to scan items in the store and check out on your phone and skip the line, and that's going to be coming to a grocery store in NYC in the next few weeks, and as well as some places in Belgium and some other places. So it's a really good time to join if you like thinking about these kinds of problems and you want to work on a product that's starting to get some real momentum.
Nice. So y'all are based out of New York City?
That's right. And so, anyone who lives here has a stronger, has a sort of a leading start, but we also, remote would be cool too.
Right. And the main app is an Ember App?
Yep, it's an Ember App.
And they get to work with you, so
yeah.
That's pretty cool.
What could be better?
Awesome. Thanks for coming by today, Alex, and chatting with us. You've been part of the Ember community for a long time now.
Yeah.
5 years or something?
Sounds about right, yeah.
10?
10 maybe, yeah.
How did you first get involved with Ember?
First meetup I went to was here in New York, and it was called the Sprout Core / Ember meetup that even back then was still being led by Luke Melia, and I think someone named Joe West at the time. I think maybe they were splitting the responsibilities, and then I just basically was doing freelancing consulting work, and then had been doing lots of Rails stuff, but didn't know how to do any sort of client-side JS, and then had a project that required me learning about it. Tried to do it in Backbone, and then had a friend who linked me to this thing called ember.js, which was basically just a view layer that supported something called two-way bindings, and they had lots of cool demos of just the stuff in the curly braces gets automatically updated without you having to sort of imperatively update those things, and I thought that was really cool. And it also, basically, I found out about it at the same time that I was just getting into open source in general. I had no idea how communities worked, how any of these other things work. And Ember was basically this just this will teach me how to do front end JavaScript stuff, and it'll be an opportunity to get really involved in open source.
So Ember is your first main open source community?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So yeah, I mean, I've known about you since getting involved with Ember a little bit after you did, but the way I see kind of your work, the two big buckets are the router, which you made a big contribution to, and then ember-concurrency, which has become, one of the most dependent on add-ons in Ember. And then, there's all this kind of work you do tangentially related to meetups and giving conference talks, and so I feel like that's kind of my impression of your involvement with the Ember community and probably most other folks. And so that's really cool to hear, first of all, that Ember is your first community. I didn't know that, just because you've had such a massive impact. We try to butter our guests up a little bit here.
I like it, it's great.
But I've always really been interested in just your work because I feel like you approach it, thinking about the high level things. You try to solve problems from first principles and make sure that you're not just papering over solutions and you're getting the primitives right. So yeah, I think, considering those buckets, maybe what we can talk about tonight is kind of your thoughts on router stuff, maybe a little bit of history around why the router is what it is today, and then some of the issues that we've chatted about at meetups, just about what you'd like to see in the router, that kind of thing. And then we can talk about ember-concurrency, and then, we asked earlier today, folks having questions, just what you're thinking about, what other things that you might be working on in the Ember space, or what lessons you've learned from, your kind of involvement and impact on the Ember community. So that's kind of where we can end up.
Sure.
Cool. So So that kind of sets the stage for how you got into Ember, and then talk a little bit about the router work that you did.
So probably the largest, most impactful contribution I made was basically making the router able, like, have a robust story around async data. And so Tom and Yehuda had basically just recently refurbished the router to convert it from something that used to be like very classic state machine. It used to be called State Manager, and the router used to be a subclass of that had sort of some sprinklings of logic that could handle URLs, and they redid that to be sort of like more built for actual URL parsing and not just sort of like bolted onto this State Manager. And then that was all those patterns for, like, you define your model hooks in the route, and then those sort of pass data to controllers, which you drive data that the template displays. All that stuff was set by them, but there was sort of some missing stories on how to handle like asynchronous data loading. So a lot of these primitives are things that people are already just using today, just because they're just in the docs. How do you load data when you enter a route? You put something in the model hook, you return a promise. And some of that was there, but there was a lot of leaks surrounding that, and having a full-on story for that basically like filled in all the corner cases, but also gave you some primitives like a transaction object that you could stash or call abort on, or retry if you wanted to sort of redirect to an authentication route and retry, transition back to where you're trying to go. All those things didn't really exist, and then that's sort of what came out of the work that I did, and that came out a little bit before Ember 1.0 was released.
Gotcha. Yeah, I remember I was an Ember developer way back then, and I remember going from like view states to like there was like a new router, and then what you worked on. I remember each time just like mind blown how much easier Ember development got. So,
Nice. Glad.
Yeah, I mean, I see kind of everything you just talked about. Like, to me, that's when people talk about using Ember versus using a view layer, the router plays a pretty important role in tying all the pieces together, right? Because you're marshaling the data, so you're interacting with Ember data, you're interacting with the old view, but the router, the route, and the controller to set up the context, and then you're ultimately rendering something like I feel like the router is really, it works with all the pieces of Ember. And so, when I teach someone Ember and I talk about, okay, you want to render a page of data, and you want to fetch some GitHub repos and display the author names, like, you're always, the router is always kind of in the back of your mind,
Mm-hmm.
So it feels like a really important coordinating piece of Ember's architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about, so I'm interested in actually the async part you mentioned. You were saying that there was no real way to deal with async data loading. Are you referring to the fact that now if you return a promise basically from the model hook, it will block rendering until that promise resolves?
Yeah. That's sort of the behavior it's had for the last 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is basically, if you immediately start rendering the moment your URL changes or the moment that you click a link, you haven't really given the UI any time to load the data. And so basically the idea is loading data can fail, like any sort of transient failure can happen when you're building web apps. And in case it does, it would be better for you to stay on the old view and not put your app in a sort of halfway transitioned state. And so the easiest the API was basically optimized towards doing the difficult thing first, like the idea of loading data before actually
Updating the URL.
Yeah, that would be
waiting
difficult.
for the server to finish.
Mm-hmm. And get the response back to you. And that would be difficult for you to build as a developer unless the framework sort of made that the default. And I think that was the right decision to make, but there's definitely some of those assumptions are probably a little too hardwired into how the router works. And so, for instance, there's an issue where if you transition to a route that has a really slow, it takes a while for that promise to resolve, for that AJAX response to come back. By default, the experience is going to be you click on something and it doesn't do anything until you sort of sprinkle some loading states or something into it to make it display that something's happening. But I think as much as that was sort of like the right default to have, it's what I'm finding out lately is particularly since people started adopting Ember concurrency, they've sort of skipped that whole process so that they can start displaying URL or the UI of the next route eagerly, and then let the data finish loading after you've already displayed templates. But it was good for. It's very empowering to have the API that we landed on 5 years ago, and I think it's good that people are evolving towards more responsive, immediate, sort of deferred loading UIs.
What do you think needs to happen to get to the point where the developer can have more control over how the data is loaded and the routes transitioning?
Well, one, I think it's really exciting that React is starting to explore the async rendering territory. I don't know if you've seen any of the videos from EmberMap lately, but it basically, they introduced this concept of fetchers so that when you are rendering a React component and then it tries to fetch something that isn't already cached, that isn't already loaded, it will sort of throw a special kind of exception that the renderer itself is aware of, and it sort of puts it, like all the stuff that we put into like the router.js micro library for like being aware that there's an async transition happening and like keeping it on the old view, they've started to build that into React itself while still letting you like move a lot of the async logic directly into the components versus the route itself. And so they're exploring the territory, which is nice because it'll give us feedback for things that we want to do for Ember. But without sort of learning from any of those experiences, I think the most important thing that needs to happen, and this is sort of something I always like to focus on whenever I'm thinking about something that could be better in Ember, is that any of the magic, there should never be any magic that's locked away into any one particular sub API of Ember. And there's a lot of magic baked right into the router. And it's the magic that makes all the async loading stuff as powerful as it is, like starting from the stuff I added like 5 years ago. But there's sort of this mental switch that you sometimes have to make with Ember APIs where if you could find a way to express in the router, great, you've got all that magic available to you. But if your designer gives you something that's slightly out of bounds of what Ember does by default, then you can often find yourself in a situation where you suddenly can't use the router magic anymore and you're building your own kind of version of it in a component or a controller or something like that. And then I think in general, something I've been thinking about a lot about lately is how do we take some of that magic out of the routes and let you apply those concepts elsewhere. And some ideas such as async components, or there's these like ideas that everyone knows that they want without knowing exactly what they should look like. But the important concept is to take that hardwired magic out of any one particular part of Ember and share it with the rest of the system.
Right. But yeah, that's great. There's so much there that I'm just reflecting on. First thing, it reminds me of some of the things that other core team folks said at EmberConf, which is, whether it's talking about Ember data or something else, it works, the happy path is great, but then the 10% of times you need to go outside of it shouldn't mean you have to opt into an entirely new set of complexities. Right. You should be able to just use the pieces that were giving you that happy path solution and then just change a few things.
Right.
Whereas it's like you said today, the router and the routes, we try our best to make our app work within them because they work so well when you're able to use them out of the box.
Not to mention, if you just go to the docs for Ember and then you look up, how do I do X, Y, Z? It's always going to have some sort of happy path solution about using routes that, if you're onboarding new team members or if you just, you want to tie into conventions as much as you can. That's the whole point of the convention or configuration framework. So when there's these sort of cases where the community or people at companies have sort of built their own ways to get around some of these conventions, it's not a great situation because then no one's doing as much knowledge sharing as they could be.
Yeah. And also the second thing it made me think of is, you were saying with async components, and this is interesting because I'm just realizing there's so much overlap here between, we kind of think of like we were saying, your router work came first, then the Ember concurrency stuff. but they're very related. I mean, they're very related, right? Because they deal with asynchronicity and they deal with state machines. So, they're very related. I think you nailed it when you said people feel like they know what they want with async components. Like, I just want a component. I want to say it loads data. But we've all been in those situations where we've gone down a path like that wasn't well defined. And then some path through the app bites us because we aren't locked into the guarantees that we get by using the router, right? So, and this is where it reminds me of, just how your APIs and ember concurrency were a really good expression of the problem. And once you buy into those, you basically you eliminate this class of problems. And like figuring out what that looks like for async components or leafs of your app loading data and all this stuff, it feels hard, but it feels like there's work there.
Right.
Like, do you feel like you know what the API is that you wish you had when it comes to something like async components?
I have a vague feeling that I'm getting closer to that. I've been doing sort of Ember API work for a while. I mean, I guess it's good to point out that, like, Ember concurrency seemed to resonate well with the community, but leading up to that was a lot of horrible ideas that I had that I thought were going to take off that just nothing really happened with it.
Mm-hmm. What were, just entertain us, what were some of those ideas?
I don't know. There's like an RFC I had about async. I don't know, like, I guess you could, if there's a way you could search GitHub for, like, Alex's, like, shortest lived RFCs, that's probably a treasure trove of, like, embarrassing moments of just, like, I'm so sure that this is right, and it's something that there's kind of like something like async computer properties, but in the routes to help you load data, because you can specify dependencies, and it's all those pieces of things that people think that they want, but then there's so many ways that have like a horrible execution of it.
I mean, async compute property is a great example of that.
Everyone wants that.
Everyone wants that.
But then you've got to think of like, okay, so you have these dependencies. Basically, when you cross the world between like your synchronous dependencies, that this property depends on this thing in order to compute its value. When you sort of extrude that into time, into the fourth dimension, then there's a million of these different states. Like which thing are you depending on? The most recently resolved value of this dependency, or do you want to invalidate the moment that this thing knows it's been invalidated? Like it's
crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, these days we try, the way we teach and the way we work is computer properties are synced. Like the rendering layer is synced and computer properties are part of that. Mm-hmm. And when we were first learning and teaching about ember concurrency, folks were saying that this really helped me because I had computer properties that were basically doing what you said. And so that's one of those things where you're reaching for something that doesn't exist and you end up using like a computed property or something else in an async way when it's really designed to be used in a sync way.
Right.
But then it feels like there's a gap there. And that's why ember concurrency filled the need. But then it also seems like kind of continuing that there's a gap there as you're describing with like the async rendering because people will bypass the router and use ember concurrency tasks to load other data. And that kind of feels like the space where there's room for another really nice abstraction to fit in.
Yeah, but I think it's also it's a win that people are now able to experiment.
Absolutely.
And because there's this design by like early Ember was a lot of APIs that were designed by Tommy Yehuda and my little sprinklings of async router stuff But eventually, you get enough people in the community, a lot of smart people like building real apps that are battle testing the APIs that were designed. And then there's been a huge shift from this idea of like the core team designs these APIs to something that's more RFC centric. Yeah. And also empowering the add-on ecosystem to experiment with these ideas. Like it's a testament to Ember's flexibility as a framework that I was even able to like take around with generators and in Ember concurrency tasks, and because so much effort, so much work went into making it just as easy as saying Ember install Ember concurrency, and that's how you start using this really cool thing. It minimizes the barrier to experimentation. Right. And I think there was some question, maybe jumping ahead to something that someone was asking on Twitter, but someone's asking, and a few people have asked, like, at what point does something like Ember concurrency wind up into Ember Core? And I don't really know what the answer is to that. It's possible that all that would mean is that it just becomes a default add-on that's included when you create a new Ember CLI app. I think it would also have to involve, there's sort of it has to coexist with actions, which are the current way that like you can click a button in a template and then that's what fires some logic in a controller or a component or something like that. And so there need to be some work to be done of bridging, like when are you supposed to use an action, when are you supposed to use a task, and maybe that could be in like an RFC or something like that. But it's probably getting close to the time where that would make sense. It's just I want to let other people lobby for that. I'm just trying to make that add-on as good as it can be and keep a lot of my use cases in mind. And if someone else decides that it's good for adoption into core, whatever that means, then I'll happily support it. But I just want to make sure that that's the right way to get. I don't want to hammer that through if
you don't want to sacrifice something on behalf of the library just for that use case. You want to make sure it continues to serve its function well, because it does its job today so well.
It's more that how do we say this? You don't just lightly change a core pattern for firing off logic from a template, and you've got all sorts of documentation for the last like 3 years. You put it in this nicely, conveniently named actions hash, and there's a few things just cosmetically that are awkward about Ember concurrency tasks. The fact that you have to like say the name of the task followed by the task function followed by function star, which just is kind of scary, and it's a lot. You got to think about someone's first. The learning curve of Ember is already like scary, and as much as Ember concurrency tasks are really, in my opinion, the only safe way to write async code.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, there's the alternative is just starting you off. It's basically async using promises starts you off unsafe until you fill all the leaks, but then the trade-off, the bridge between that, a promise and an action to something that's kind of well contained if you express it as an Ember concurrency task, still has this big like cosmetic gross bit, and some things that might make that better are if the decorator's proposal and Experimentation don't settle enough that there's nicer ways that you can express tasks in
opt
conjunction with
into the functionality maybe over existing actions or existing syntax instead of having to swap it completely.
Yeah.
Though, like a few months ago, we started using like async await in all of our Ember code, and I kind of noticed that, man, our actions that deal with promises kind of look a lot like tasks. Like before, we would have like a bunch of promises with .then, but now that where we have async and a task.
So you have an actions and async functions in there.
Yep, and we have async function. We use async await in there. So it looks like cosmetically, it looks more like a task.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if
So that desugars just to using promises, right? A function with promises.
Yep.
Well, yeah, to get sort of in the nitty gritty, and I don't know if it's the time or place to get into the nitty gritty.
No, I think our listeners would like that for sure.
Well, so one of the parts of a task is its sort of concurrency constraint. Like, is it a task that can run concurrently every time you call perform on it? Is it a restartable task? Is it a drop task? And I think, the add-on's more than 2 years old at this point, and I think the default task should have been probably drop. Like, chances are, if you've got a long-running thing, you don't want multiple of it running. That's kind of exceptional behavior that you should probably opt into. The best default is probably a task that can't run while it's already running.
So that's like the submitting a form where users click twice.
Yeah.
And that you would want that concurrency to be dropped because you're already running the first instance.
Right.
It's in queue now.
No, it's like maybe does it make sense to give a quick background?
Sure, absolutely.
So, we're talking about Ember concurrency, and Ember concurrency is an Ember add-on that gives you this task primitive. So anything that you would express as like an action that that creates promises and calls .then on them and chains a bunch of stuff together, you would replace with the sort of syntax that looks a lot like the async function syntax, but instead of using the await keyword, you use the yield keyword, and I guess the best way is to just check out some of the examples on ember-concurrency.com. But one of its main strengths, aside from like a clearer way to express like async there's just syntactically a nicer way to sort of flatten out your async code so it just kind of looks like a synchronous function, but async stuff is happening. Aside from the syntactic wins, there's also just like the ability to constrain like whether this task can run while it's already running, to constrain its concurrency. So the example you just brought up is if you're submitting a form, I think everyone's like seen examples of forms that warn you like don't press the submit button again, it might like screw up the entire world. And classically in Ember, if you wanted to write that, you'd probably have to like set some property of like is submitting true, and then that grays something out, and then you'd at the beginning of your action just test like if is submitting, then return. All these sort of like guard logic that you have to put on all the edges of some async boundaries to make sure that it doesn't sort of run while it's already running. These are things that are well expressed, like easy to express and easy to constrain if you're using Ember concurrency tasks. So the default that Ember concurrency does today, I made it so that it behaves closest to actions, which is that it doesn't constrain concurrency at all. It'll enforce that a task doesn't live beyond its host object's lifetime. So you're not gonna wind up in a situation where you have a set timeout that does something destructive after the component's already been unrendered. Those problems go away, but there's still nothing to stop you from, triple quadruple happening. Yeah.
A bunch of times.
But so to get that behavior, the safe behavior for those like double form submissions, you have to say .drop on the task that says drop any attempts to perform the task while it's already running. Drop's kind of a weird name. I kind of stole it from like channels and Go. You can have these dropping channels that sort of do the same thing. But that probably should have been the default behavior, because most times when you're, I think, writing a task, if you forget that modifier, it's probably weird. Like you might be doing something wrong. It's sort of an indication that like you might have left a leak where something in your UI is going to let you perform that task while it's already running. So I think
I just thought of Ed's animation demo where he clicks the button and they're all animating.
Mm-hmm.
That's like an example of
or you do want it.
You do want it, yeah. But I don't write many apps like that.
Yeah.
Where the user's clicking a button, things are flying into the screen.
Yeah, it's kind of like sometimes it kind of reminds me of maybe early demos of like I mentioned when I first got into Ember, it was basically a view layer that supported two-way binding, and so a lot of the demos are just like check it out. I like type in this input field and like 4 things updated at the same time, but like how often are you writing UIs where like this thing impacts all the other things at the same time? There's always sort of layers or buffers in between that.
Right. So, going back to the action and task thing, do you have any thoughts about how you want to see that end up, like concretely, like if anyone did want to work on championing an RFC, how would you like to see those unified, or is that still a pretty unexplored space in your mind?
I don't know, I can imagine something, like there's a nice shorthand syntax. So it's like whenever you were defining a function or a method on a component, you always used to have to say name of the method, function, parentheses, like.
Right.
So you were saying, okay, so in the actions hash, you have to specify the name of the action and then colon, and then
right, so basically
a function.
Right, and there's a sort of shorthand that people have been using since I think it was one of the ES sort of specifications came out, where you can sort of just say name of the function, parentheses, and sort of skip having to type the word function there. And if you're using that syntax, you can just put an asterisk at the beginning of it, and then you've defined a generator function like right on that. It's the same shorthand syntax. So we could imagine something where like on actions, any actions that are generator functions are like dropping tasks or something like that. That could be a potential way to get it in there. And if you want to use a more specific concurrency constraint modifier like restartable or something like that, then you have to sort of like escalate it to a uglier syntax, but that might be a nice default.
Nice.
I haven't thought too hard about that, but could work.
Cool. So, we've talked about the evolution of the router, some of the things that you could see it turning into. we have some questions here that I'd like to get into as well. But before we do, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the stuff we were talking about at the last Ember meetup. You were talking about some of the ways that your current app kind of stresses Ember's router patterns.
Sure.
And maybe some of the stuff from Uber Ribs
Sure.
that you were interested in and maybe could see making its way into an add-on or even the router itself.
Right. Well, I'll preface this by saying it's really hard to talk about this stuff and feel like whoever I'm talking to gets the main takeaway. I guess I'll just go right into it. So I maintain a mobile Ember app that is, it's basically we use Cordova to basically embed an Ember app into something that pretends to be a native iOS app and Android app, and that's what we've been using for the last 4 years. And I have found that there's just some stuff that is really difficult to do when you're writing a mobile Ember app, particularly one that is driven by WebSockets and events received from the server. And it's really hard to implement an app like that in general, but in particular, it seems at odds with a lot of the defaults that are built, a lot of the assumptions that are baked into the router. And there are assumptions that you wouldn't even know were assumptions until you've tried to build this kind of app. And I was having such a hard time describing what is difficult about it that I tried to give like a name or a classification to the kind of app that's really difficult to build in Ember. And so I a year ago wrote this article called Ember Rideshare, and it basically introduced this. It's like if you were to imagine building Lyft or Uber in Ember, I think even the most seasoned Ember developers would have a really tricky time doing it in a way that felt like it used the conventions that Ember gives out of the box. So Ember starts you off right away thinking about URLs, and if you sort of think about URLs first, then you won't have to bolt it on to the app later, and then all these things will just work. And then if you structure your app this way, just so many things are easier. That is not really the case, and I will try to explain why. How do I say this? So there is a sort of implicit assumption that the Ember router makes, that a lot of Ember API makes in general, which is that you should try and constrain, how do I say this? There's a lot of state transition logic that happens at the leaves of your app. And by leaves, I mean, you could say that you can imagine in your router.map file, you're jotting out, you're expressing all the different states that your app can be in, and every leaf route, every route at the edge is a leaf.
Post.post.edit.
Exactly, yeah. Or admin. Yeah, exactly. Admin.post. Whatever, and you're describing your topmost route that everything belongs to is the application route, which is the first route that gets entered when you start an Ember app, and you can sort of put a lot of initialization logic there and other things. But if you look at a lot of Ember's examples for how do you build a login form? Well, you make a login route that might be the child of some other route, and then in some submit form action, you will fire a request that hits the server, and then the server will give you an auth token. And then from there, you will say, okay, well, now that I have an auth token, maybe I'll set that state on somewhere or on some model or some service. And then I'll say this dot transition to, default logged in route or something like that. And so that logic of where do I go? How do I transition from not being logged in to logged in? All that logic lives sort of in that action handler on your login route at the leaf. And in one way, that sort of is in line with a lot of good programming practices that you should try and encapsulate your code as much as possible to be. If the rest of your app doesn't need to know about how to transition between logged in and logged out, then it's good that you should put that logic into one space. And you'll find a lot of examples if you just go through Ember documentation, or if you look at people's blogs for the conventional ways for writing Ember apps and how to handle all these things. Even if you found something like more cutting edge that was like, how do you write a login form using like an Ember concurrency dropping task so you can deal with like double submits and all that stuff, it still suffered from the same problem of like figuring out how to transition global app state happening like in a leaf. And on its own, that's not bad right until the moment, it's totally fine to do things that way, that logic at the leaves, right up until the moment that your app starts having to deal with server-side changes. So if you have a WebSocket connection that is where the state of your client-side app and the stuff that you're allowed to, the routes that you're allowed to visit is really coupled and dependent on what the server tells you is your state, that puts you in a completely different kind of app.
So this is the example, you're in Lyft and you're on a ride. And so your app is showing you where you are, and none of that is initiated by the user. And if there was 2 clients hooked up to that account, they'd see the same thing.
Yeah.
So the source of truth for the state of the router is no longer in your browser's URL bar.
Exactly.
It's also too like the ride ends,
Right.
and then all of a sudden you end up on a new page. Like, how was your ride?
Yeah, you can't go to the request cancellation route if your ride ends.
Right.
And usually, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking. So I've never dealt with these problems, so I'm like kind of like the naive Ember developer here, and I would think like you would have some service that listened to WebSocket events and had a bunch of transition twos in it,
Right.
something like that. What are some problems that would come from that?
Well, one is that services are global. Services can be injected into literally every other possible thing. And the easiest services to use in Ember, or the services that are least likely to have bugs and get screwed up, are the stateless services. You could have an AJAX service that is good at stitching together AJAX requests based on some context and solves that kind of problem, but it doesn't maintain any state on its own. It just helps you do things. Those are the good kinds of services, but when you start having some service that keeps track of state, and where you're allowed to be depends on that state, and that state can be invalidated at any time, you're going to have to write things. Just the fact of that means you're going to have to write things very differently than your normal Ember app, where you're handling things at the leaves, and you're putting link tos everywhere, which is another sort of transition that you're defining at the leaves. And you have to sort of, you wouldn't want to write that promisey action submit form action the same way that you would if you know that you're going to have to deal with server-side changes invalidating things at any point. And so your app is already starting to look a lot different than the example codes you see online. And secondly, you start to run into cases where that what I talked about earlier of if there's something I could improve about Ember is that there should never be magic locked up away in one particular API that isn't accessible anywhere else. And one example that I think that maybe wouldn't be obvious at the forefront, but is this idea that the URL is the one and only driving force of everything in your app. Because Ember made a bet, 5-6 years ago, which is pretty smart, that the first thing that it should make you think about the URL, because you're writing web apps after all, and this is going to be really difficult for you to bolt onto your app later. So think about URLs first, structure your app that way, and then you're never going to have you're going to avoid a lot of problems with introducing that later.
And that's because the URL is basically outside of your app. I mean, it lives outside of it. Your app is really derived from it. It can change without knowledge of your app. I mean, you can close the browser, you can open it at a different URL, so it feels like the entry point. And then the Ember app is almost derived view of that URL.
Yeah, you can think of your app as a giant async compute property dependent on the URL, with a lot of like machinery in the middle to help.
It's like a computed property that switches on the URL and renders the right component.
Yeah, and fans out into a sort of like promise tree to help you resolve all that data and stuff. But I mean, that is what it is.
That is an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
But then when you introduce the idea that the source of truth is really in a database on the server,
or a combination of things, like it's totally fine that you would still have URL driven apps, but there's a constraint that needs to be solved when you have things state changes originating from the server. I mean, how do I say this? If the first place that you visit to introduce a new page, the first file that you open when you're going to implement a new feature, add a new page to your Ember app is your router.js file.
Router.js.
You're going to add something to your router.map, and you are teaching Ember like a new constraint of when the URL looks like that, looks like this.
Do these things.
Yeah, you are only in here.
Instantiate these objects, render this name template.
Exactly. And you're basically saying, I'm not in any of these other states, I'm not in any of these other routes, I'm in this one. That is a kind of magic that I think needs to be extended to things other than the URL. So, for instance, the way today that if you want to make an admin route that you're only allowed to enter, or a sort of family of admin routes that you only want to be able to enter when you have a logged in admin user, that's today's way of doing that. And this is one of the APIs that I added to the async router like 5 years ago, is use this before model hook. Mm-hmm. Put that on your admin route and then have that check the auth service. Is a user signed in? Is this user an admin? And if not, transition somewhere else. Maybe transition to a login form or something like that. And that's another one of these cases where that's sort of the flip side of the anti-pattern of developing at the leaves, where it's good that you've blocked entry to this hierarchy of routes, but then what if you're in one of these routes already?
And you get fired.
Yeah, you get fired.
No, really. And you have a session that's on your computer. Yeah. And now your data changes and your Ember app knows it, but you're not
an admin anymore.
Yeah, but you're not going through before model. You've already made it through before model.
Yeah, you're already in the gate. So that constraint of whether you're allowed to be in the route needs to be escalated to the URL's status. Right. You can enter this, you can be in this route so long as the URL is this and you are an admin.
Right.
And then I think this is just something that needs to creep into Ember in the same way. I think basically Ember needs to make a bet on this in the same way they did with the URL. Like the bet being like 5 years ago, you're going to have to use the URL at some point. You should think about it first because it's really hard to add later. They should be making the same bet today of plan on real time. Things are going to become more real time, and it's going to be really hard to bolt on later, and it's going to make all your pre-existing code look kind of crappy. Right. Or you're going to have like that logic in two different places, one in your before model hook, and then in some other like observer subscription to that state that says that you have to be smart enough to activate and then deactivate it as you enter and leave the admin route, but that does the same thing as that entry logic.
I can't help but think about the series we're working on for EmberMap right now. It's declarative rendering. You and I were talking about this earlier, and the idea there is what Handlebars gave us is if you have a computed property and you put a variable in a template, if you put curly first name in a template, you have so many guarantees from that you wouldn't normally think about. If you think about doing a naive thing where you want to display a JavaScript variable in a template and you do like inner HTML, and now that variable can change, so you have something like an observer that says when that changes, rerun it. All of the different ways when you code in a way that's not taking advantage of Handlebars' declarative syntax, you get bitten by, right? You write a component that works when it first renders, but then on an update, you forgot to do something. And so you have to hook into did receive adders and make sure you re-render it that way. Whereas if you use a computed property that has the dependent keys specified and you use a Handlebars variable, Ember gives you a guarantee that no matter how that state changes, the template, the output will be correct.
Right.
And I feel like this is a very similar thing where when you're saying before model, you're saying when the user came in this way, we need to make sure such and such conditions met, therefore render this.
Yeah.
But if you had if you had a higher level API that lets you declare what it means to be valid to be in this route, what the rules are, what the constraints are, because that's what you keep saying.
Yeah.
And that declaration lives somewhere, whether it was a route or some other file or a service or something, then the tools could take care of, okay, if I click on a link that brings me here, I'm going to check that thing.
Right.
If the server makes a change, I'm going to check that thing.
Right.
Because really what you want is, like if you're talking about how would I describe Uber or Lyft, you would have like you could write that out in like a logical series of statements. Given the user is on a ride, then they are seeing this. And it's just given the state of the world.
Right.
Then do this. It's not it's not how, it's not imperative steps. I click the link or I hit the back button. It's just a declarative, it's a declarative set of rules with constraints based on the state of the user or the state of the world.
Yeah.
So I just couldn't help but think of that because that comes up in our discussions a lot because I feel like a lot of what has come to the JavaScript community in the last 5 years is this notion of declarative programming in lots of ways. It's the same true as ember-concurrency. Instead of doing steps and saying if I have destroyed myself or if I'm still alive, then don't call this thing, right? All those guards that you put in your code. But if you have a declarative syntax like .drop, .restartable, and you just declare your intention for the thing you're trying to do, the tool can do so much more.
Exactly.
And it can prevent you from ever getting in those awkward states that you hadn't considered yet, like, I had considered a user clicking a link, but not if I got fired.
Right.
Because there's so many paths in our apps where, you just write that code, and like, what if the user gets fired? And you hadn't considered that. And you want your tools to help you fall into that pit of success, as they always say, where the states you hadn't considered by default work instead of break.
Right. Yeah. So basically, I love the pit of success idea because in this particular realm, they throw you into all the wrong pits.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm always a little hesitant to bring this up because it doesn't sound like either of you are writing this kind of app, and most people aren't.
The one app that I did write that had some similarities was when I was at TED and we were writing an app that showed the status of all these encodes going on in the conference. So there was like 11 cameras that were encoding video files. And it was a dashboard that showed a bunch of progress bars. And all that stuff was coming from a node server. So it was just a view of server state. And it had to be real time because it was updating. So I didn't do a model hook. Like the app initialized and it gets a WebSocket connection. That was it. And I just kind of did the naive approach that you mentioned in the beginning, like what an Ember developer would do today. Like make a service, make a WebSocket event handler service that took all the events, normalized the data, and push it all into the Ember data store. And so my store was always up to date. And then I just like big switch statement, given an encode in progress, in state progress, in state finished, in state errored, then render this. So that was definitely a new way of thinking because I didn't have the convenience of the router. I didn't have a convenience of all the different routes that I was in. Like, was I in /encodes /done or /new? It was just one template because all the state was driven by like my Ember data models. And it was like, it felt very awkward. Like I was making a bunch of components that were named different things that were basically switching on status, a property that happened to be on the model.
Right.
And I totally felt like an unconventional Ember app. I mean, I think it was understandable. Like I think an Ember developer would be able to come in and understand why I'd set up that way.
Right.
But absolutely, I agree, it was not taking advantage of. I mean, I didn't have the benefits of the state machine and the router, basically.
Right.
So
on top of that, I think in addition to you want an API that puts you in a pits of success. I think the other part about this is that Ember doesn't only make it difficult if you're making this kind of app, but it also kind of gives you this kind of guilt. Like you're doing things wrong
because you're not using
right.
named
like,
routes.
You're like, why? This is sort of like this is usually I express this kind of state as like the URL, but it's not the URL. It's like some property on like a user model.
Yep.
Should I feel like am I doing something wrong? And so if the conventions are wrong, they can punish you, even though like what you're building
is
really
the best given what you have.
Yeah.
I think I heard you say this once, like convention over configuration shame or something like that. It's such a good.
I don't know. Probably something.
Maybe
like that.
it's such a good saying. Good way.
I mean, that's when it works, it's great, but
yeah.
It's funny, you asked if we had worked on these apps, and I haven't worked on any real-time app or anything, but I'm working on a regular web app right now, and one of the features is you can switch users. And when you switch users, like, I have like this logic that just kind of blows away the page and re-renders everything. So I didn't know I had this problem, but as you two are talking, I'm like, oh, this is totally an instance of when I've encountered this.
I feel like I should also say that the kinds of problems I like to solve, when they are finally solved, they usually involve letting people know they had a bigger problem than they realized.
Yeah.
So that was definitely the case with ember concurrency because nobody
Felt the need
at all.
If you
And
yeah,
so, yeah.
that's great. Because if you ask me, is how do you do async? I'd be like, oh, promises are great.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have known.
Yeah.
Like, you don't know what's on the next
Your
level.
brain would be trained to be like, well, wouldn't you just, that's sort of
yeah,
what you
we're
guys-
just
Totally.
Yep.
No, I mean you were just saying, you don't know how many people are running into this, so you feel like you might be like on an island based on the app you're building.
Yeah.
But I do think it's more like what you're describing, and I think even though we haven't written a bunch of apps like Lyft, there's still this stuff comes up. You're editing an article, and now you want some other person to be able to edit it, or they go to edit it, and now you start stomping on each other's data. Right. There's concurrent editors, or there's multiple people using the admin at the same time, or someone has it open and someone else makes a change and they don't see the newest data.
Right.
These are all come back to the same root problem, which is when we develop an Ember app, we're used to thinking about it client first. Like the current user's browser is the source of truth,
Right.
is the initiator of the actions.
Right. That's the other part of it, is that it's the implicit assumption that it's going to be the user driving most of the state changes.
Yes.
And you wouldn't know it, but a lot of Ember's APIs that make that assumption very deeply. And so just pulling that assumption away, there's a lot of things that are really difficult to do in Ember.
I mean, even like clicking an action, and it just runs this code. But where's the knowledge of all the constraints in the system that might be driven by the server?
Right, because that's another thing.
Because you've loaded the data by the time you got there. So it's going to run that action based on the data you happen to have when you visited the route. But what if it's changed since then?
Right. And I think there's some value that, I think it's totally fine that you would have a period of time since the last time that you synced with the server that you can sort of muck around and make a mess of things and then submit something and then realize that the state has changed and respond to that.
Right.
But it shouldn't.
There should be primitives that help you build that kind of UI.
Right. When you need to fill in that gap, you shouldn't just be left in the dark or whatever. Yeah.
Yep. Hard set of problems for sure.
Do you think a lot of this is driven from HTTP being a request response protocol, and then this WebSocket stuff is fairly new, and now it's like, oh shit, we have these problems and these are things we need to deal with?
I think
Yeah, but I think this kind of reminds me of another thing I've been thinking about lately, which is that it's kind of an obvious concept, but in general, you should always try and use the data structure or the system or the object that inherently expresses the most invariance and constraints by default. So I've been thinking about this thing
We were just talking about that last week on the podcast.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, great. Yeah, it probably goes with the
Yeah.
state, well, maybe some of the declarative state stuff.
Yep.
But it's just if you are making an app that only deals with squares, then maybe use a square class and not a rectangle class. Or if you're trying to model an ancestry tree, maybe model that as... Actually, I made this mistake the other day. It's not always a tree, because what happens when two trees, it's
There's not a shared root.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm trying to say is you shouldn't use a data structure that's going to let you express that, I'm the son of Bob, but Bob is my son. You should use a data structure that doesn't let you make that mistake.
We were talking about this last week in the context of data modeling and database design, and it was a term that we recently heard called making the impossible impossible.
Okay, yeah.
And the idea is if there's an impossible situation in your business logic, your data structure ideally should make it impossible to express that.
Right.
So we were talking about polymorphic relationships. So a comment points to either a video or a post. So how would you design the database column if you had a video ID and a post ID? It could point to both, and that's impossible. So instead you do commentable ID and commentable type.
Yeah.
So it's either one or the other.
Right.
So it comes through also in our code, whether you use arrays and types and all these things.
Right.
So is this kind of related to what we were talking about the meetup, where you were trying to illustrate the tree and the router states?
Yes. What were we talking about just before we got...
Data structures and
and
the tree.
The router being driven by the client clicking a button and the possible states. I mean, one thing you said was that one of the problems with the current router is...
Oh, no, I know what it
Got
is. It was, you were asking about, is this maybe a hangover of HTTP request response? And
I would say that there are, when you can model something as request response, you should, because that is a really nice, you're not going to get a response without you having kicked off a request. And when you can take advantage of that invariant, there are different ways that you can express that. So for instance, like if you're dealing with event-driven code, you might actually need to have a handler for each possible event that can fire, and you don't know when it's going to fire. The server's just going to tell it to you. But in the case of request and response, you might be able to have more constraints in place, which is that you don't need to put that handler out at the top level in some globally accessible way. It's going to be constrained to the response that actually, or the request that actually issued it. And there's nothing wrong with that approach if that is what you're modeling. But if you don't, there's no request associated with the server telling you that suddenly you're not logged in, or you're fired, you're no longer an admin, or in your Uber Lyft app, you're no longer in a ride. And so use request response when you can, but not everything is modeled that way, and then you need something to help you. If you got a server, if you're really writing something that's event driven, we need to think about what the patterns can help you along that way.
Should the router have one current active route?
I don't know. I'm starting
How do you not know?
I'm starting.
I expect you have the answer by now.
Well, I've been exploring. So basically, I can talk about all these things that are missing or that are difficult for me to write in my app, and I'm working. Like I'm sketching out and having these kinds of conversations and trying to get other people's perspectives. And okay, so you're asking whether are we going to continue having? Is there ever going to be a case where you're in more than one route at the same time? Very oddly specific, but what made you ask that?
That was from our conversation,
right? And
talking about some of the problems that you felt came about from the Ember router being the only instance of the state machine. It's like a singleton state machine that is godlike over your app. It completely determines what's being rendered.
Right.
And as soon as you transition or start loading something and it kicks it off into a transition period, you just don't have control over anything, right? It just goes from one to the other. It's very, very constrained.
Right.
And so, like you were saying before, if you looked at an app, I've heard this come up also, talking about stack navigation. Mm-hmm. And so if you're looking at an app like that and you're trying to express it, maybe the current way that the router works is not the best way to express that.
Yeah, I'm leaning in the direction that we need to rethink that. So I guess I can just remember, without really understanding why people were asking for this, just over the years, some people have asked, like, can you have concurrent routes? Can you be in this state and that state at the same time? And I mean, your URL is either one string or it's another string. Right. And so on that level, you can't be in multiple states, really. But I guess I've sort of changed the way that I think about that now. So when you were talking about the navigation stack, so this is a separate but also very difficult problem or challenge towards doing this
to achieve this with the current.
Yeah, if you're writing a mobile app, iOS, if you're using just the native iOS Cocoa primitives, gives you this thing called a UI navigation controller, which is a stack. And you push view controllers onto the stack, and that's what does the animation. And you can do all sorts of clever things, like you can sort of have interactive animations where if you start to swipe, but then you let go, then you don't actually complete the transition. And trying to think about how to model that using routes, your first instinct is going to be, okay, every one of those frames is a route. But then what does it mean for you to start to reveal the underlying route, but then like take your finger off of it and then abort that transition?
I'm just having flashbacks to meetup night. We were doing this for probably 50 minutes.
Yeah.
Sitting there on my phone, sliding back and forth.
Right.
Because it really is a very perplexing UI to try to express coming from a typical web background.
Right. And there are some interesting ideas that I've only been recently made aware of that get you close, but I still don't think anyone's really nailed it on the head as to how to model this. And the thing is, you can't just do what iOS does or what Android does because they don't have the constraint of the URL.
Right.
And I think if we are going to solve this and do it well, to be able to say we solve both would be awesome. And I don't think they're at odds with each other. We just have to think really hard and deeply about this stuff. This really interesting stuff involving state and URLs and stack routing. But one thing that maybe even when we were talking about this, I didn't have a firm understanding of it. But Edward Faulkner from the core team has done a lot of work. I think originally, for the last 3 years, I think it was driven by a desire to make the primitives or the binding layer between Liquidfire and Embers internals a little less gross. He worked on an RFC that basically standardized this thing called outlet state. And basically this is built right into Ember, but when you internally, when Ember is parsing a URL and building all the internal data structures for which routes are entering into which outlets and which data is loaded into this, that, and the other thing, eventually when that data loading process is done, it emits this giant blob of a thing called outlet state. And then those get passed to the various templates, and the outlet helpers kind of take off a piece of that tree that they know about, and it's very constrained. And what I believe, if I'm getting all this right, is that Liquidfire internally, if you have liquid outlet, those are just being driven by these outlet states. So in one URL rendering, the liquid outlet will grab onto one of these outlet states, which says render this thing with this model and this controller, I think. And then if the URL ever changes, then this thing's going to get another outlet state, and it has a pretty reasonably well serialized two different things that it can render at the same time, right? So that's sort of getting in the area of what we need. The problem is, imagine if you refresh the browser on the current page that you're on, then you don't have the old outlet states. They don't exist until you try and render them. So let me say the problem that the outlet state would solve. You would be able to model clicking around and pushing onto this navigation stack, because that navigation stack, which is kind of like a liquid outlet, can maintain a reference to all the old outlet states. But those outlet states were only generated because you went into those routes to begin with.
Right.
So wherever you wind up and however you've serialized or stored, maybe you put it in local storage, maybe you put it in something else, maybe you put it in the URL, this navigational history of all the places you've been to before here, once you refresh the page, you're going to be only loading the outlet state for this thing. So the moment you try to interactive swipe backwards, you're going to have to kind of be in two routes at the same time.
I see. So this is it feels like we're back to the declarative thing, where it's easy to make it work if you know the user's coming from master to detail.
Right.
I can just throw it onto an array in memory.
Yeah.
And then when I go back, I can check if I have that in memory or not.
Right.
But now there's a new way to get there.
Right.
Reload the page, deep link to my app from Twitter or something like that.
Right.
And so now I go back, that there's nothing in memory to represent that previous state. So we have this problem again.
Right. So to bring it back to your question of, is there ever going to be a case where you want to have kind of concurrent routes to be more in more than one route at the same time? And I think that's currently the best solution I can think of now. And I want to explore it more because I really don't know what I'm talking about until I actually try these things out. But the prevailing model for the last 5 years is that if the URL is this, then your entire app is in this state. It really means something to be in this state. You're here in this app, not in any other. You're here in this route and not in any other route. And there's some logic. There's sort of activate and deactivate hooks that you can write to ensure that some subscription, to subscribe to maybe server-side events and then unsubscribe. And so the question of how to handle those hooks when you can be, if in this future potential concurrent routing thing, is going to be a lot more difficult.
Right.
But my thinking is that you are going to want the ability to be in multiple routes at the same time. You're going to want the ability to be in multiple routes that are the exact same hierarchy but with different params at the same time. For instance, if you imagine, how would you model this? How would you model the Twitter app if you're going from tweet to tweet to tweet? They're all the same route, they just have a different ID. So you're going to have to be in the same route with different data at the same time. And then what I think though is if you loosen those constraints and make that possible, which really doesn't seem that hard on the face of it, what you would have to introduce is an API that, like, if Ember currently says that if your URL is this, you're in this route, this is your current app state, this is where you are, this is what your app state is, you're going to need to introduce that via some other concept, depending on like which route are you looking at, which route are you presenting, which is the main active one. And kind of floating around related to all these ideas I'm playing around with is just this idea of like lifetimes, lifespans, and it's kind of deeply intertwined with like ember concurrency stuff that like, so let me try to define some of these things. Ember concurrency tasks are allowed to run until the object that it lives on is destroyed. There's this, whether or not it's made explicit by the API, there's this concept of a lifespan that you could name for all of Ember concurrency's use cases, like Ember object lifetime or something.
Init to destroy.
Init to destroy.
They're bounded.
Yeah. And if some people that use Ember concurrency know that if you try to use an Ember concurrency task, like particularly one that has like a loop, a timer loop, a polling loop inside of it, if you try to put that on a route, then you're going to need to either explicitly cancel that route in a deactivate hook, or you're going to need to say like .cancel on deactivate, so it can sort of clean up itself. And because routes live forever, like the Ember objects, a route Ember object does not ever get destroyed, so you can't use that lifespan, which I think is something that's like that's one of these kind of gross areas where I'd love to be able to constrain it a little bit better.
Right.
And
it made sense, and then
but it means it's one of these things that it's one of the reasons that's so nice to use an Ember concurrency task on a component is that those have the most constrained lifespans. And so if you can find a way to put some logic on a component and it doesn't like do the whole like put logic on the leaves fallacy that might bite you for a real-time driven app, then you should.
Right.
Because then you get all the cleanup for free.
Yep, absolutely. Right. By the way, I will just mention for our listeners, you keep saying for folks who use Ember concurrency. If anyone doesn't use Ember concurrency and is listening to this, you should definitely give it a shot. You have no idea what you're missing.
I hear there's a screencast course that teaches you how to use it.
I think so.
So going back to like the routes and kind of how they live forever, this goes back to what you were saying with like the data structures where you want to, the constraint there is you want them to be destroyed when you're off the page.
So, you want as constrained lifespans as possible. You also want escape hatches because there actually are real problems. The other object that lives forever once it exists is a controller. And that's where people dump a lot of state that should be persisted when you leave and then come back to a route. And you can sort of laugh at that and say that's like global variables and whatnot. But the thing is, it solves real problems, and there's conventions around that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
right. Totally. If whatever the next router becomes has more constrained lifespans, we can't leave all the people putting a bunch of state on controllers in the dust. There needs to be a way to kind of bring back those persistent buckets of state. And I think there's already Ember State Services that I think Stefan Penner maintains, and that is a good, reasonable place to put something like that. State that lives beyond the lifespan of what you're looking at. It also solves the problem of it basically associates state with a certain like hash key or cache key. But if things change so that controllers or routes or components or whatever the future is have much more constrained lifespans, then that would be a nice solution to use in general to like put all the sticky stuff, the stuff that like persists for a while, onto that. But it should be maybe another kind of concept that's floating around is to sort of start constrained and sprinkle the long lifespans or the things that last. Or I think you were talking about a gem earlier that that assumed that everything's open by default. The things that you could access, the things that were returned by JSON resource, JSON API resource. Mm-hmm. It would be much better to start constrained so that you don't accidentally give something away or lose something or realize that you've got to plug some leak later on. And I think that would be a much nicer approach that I would like to see in the future.
You're saying in default, having when things are torn down visually, have the state that's backing those visual things be erased, and only opt into having them persist beyond the lifespan of the visual portion of it if you need it, because that's the more surprising thing. That's kind of what you're saying?
I think that I think there's a few different lifespan concepts floating around that need to be formalized. Currently, the only one there's just one implicit one today, which is the lifespan of an Ember object from init to destroy. That happens to be a really useful lifespan for components because that corresponds to when they're displayed and destroyed. Technically, will insert element to will destroy element, but I believe all the cases, like will destroy element is immediately followed by will destroy, so there's no difference between those two. But if you're thinking about this, the Ember equivalent of the UI navigation controller, where two things might be sort of overlapping and depending on like where your finger is dragging, there's also lifespans of like your component might still be alive. It hasn't had destroy called on it yet, but you know it's outgoing. You know you have done a full-on swipe that isn't interactive anymore,
right.
or like assuming that these the sort of constraint-driven APIs are introduced to Ember, and you're no longer logged in as an admin, then all those components that might be driving data could have a lifespan called like presenting or something die before the Ember destroy lifespan ends. So I hope I'm not totally losing you guys or everything here. I think there needs to be a layering of a thing called a lifespan. And how do you use those? You can put Ember concurrency tasks in the lifespan so that you know that when, for instance, if you want to have a task that immediately gets destroyed the moment a user starts to navigate away, if you have well-designed, well-defined, and well-named lifespans for each of these states that you can be in, that would be a lot easier.
So this is interesting. It's almost like hooks aren't enough. You need like this actual like primitive that's a lifespan that you can
Well, it's like if you express as a lifespan, you get the behavior in those hooks for free without having to write the hooks and define all the cleanup logic and all the borders, right? I could have left out the feature in Ember concurrency that stopped a task when it was destroyed, and then I would say everyone that wants to use an Ember concurrency task safely has to just like insert or put a like task.destroy in a will destroy.
Right.
But that sucks.
Right.
The default is usually that you want it to be cleaned up, so that's what the default is. And if you express things in the lifespans, there's a lot more derived state, right? The big thing about Ember concurrency is that you don't have state
in multiple places. It's already the task is already in a certain state. If I could just ask it what that state is, then I don't have to say this.set is saving true. Right.
So that works out really well because there's a really helpful, useful, implicit lifespan from init to destroy. But I would love to see that concept expand, and I think would have to in the introduction of concurrent routing, right? This like interactive navigation outlet, or whatever you want to call it, the thing that is the equivalent of iOS.
Yeah, I have a question. So, I mean, we talked about the animation stuff that Ed worked on, and how this actually this is part of this, some of the source for this, or some of the first uses that brought up this problem were animation, because Ed is sitting there trying to make liquid outlet work in a world where there's one active route, and so he has to duplicate it and basically fake two active routes in order to have his entering view and his exiting view, which simultaneously are rendered at the same time.
Right.
So you already have a notion there of like two active routes, but it's like hacked together, right? Because the APIs weren't there. I mean, it was hacked in a sense to get it to work with Ember.
Right.
So now he has this thing that he introduced to EmberComp, which is like entering, exiting, updating, right? With Ember animation, where you have these simultaneously things on the screen at the same time. But those have those hooks or ways that you can control what's happening when they are coming in, when they are going out, or when they're just staying the same. And I can't help but think that there's some similarity there between that and those APIs and what we're talking about with transitioning routes. components coming up and down with did insert and will destroy, routes being activated with activate and deactivate, and now views with Ember, with Ed's animation library coming in and out. So I'm wondering, do you feel like is there something common about all these things? Is it good that we have separate ideas for them because really presenting a route is very different from an entering view, or?
I think there's definitely some carryover, and it's a very active area of thought. Yeah. My leaning currently, which could change if someone convinces me otherwise, is that this idea of lifespans, and you being able to have a sort of an arsenal of helpful, useful ones that you can choose from depending on what problem you're modeling. Mm-hmm. I think that should exist. Mm-hmm. And I think there's going to be a handful of lifespans that are driven by those kinds of APIs. So for instance, like, I don't know if this makes sense. This could be silly, but like you could say whatever the API is for like attaching an Ember concurrency task to like start within a certain lifespan and end when the lifespan ends. I can imagine a lifespan being sort of defined by the thing that's presenting your component. Mm-hmm. So if that happens to be like the animated stuff, that is like the presenter is this thing that does that kind of D3-ish enter exit API and is smart enough to like start and end and manipulate the lifespans that these components can write. And I think that would be a nice like layer of decoupling.
Interesting. So there you almost have the notion of a lifespan existing as its own primitive, and then these other things, the parent is able to define the lifespan of a relevant child, whether it's a task that has to do some asynchronous code,
right,
whether it's a view that has to be animated in or out,
right,
whether it's a route that needs to be activated or deactivated, but they all have this notion. Yeah, it's interesting to think if there could be a single primitive there,
right,
that has a single interface.
And you could imagine some nice APIs that I guess don't clobber the namespace of lifespan. So I mean, you could imagine importing a lifespan from Ember animated is animating or is visible while another thing hasn't finished transitioning but might be canceled or whatever you want to call it. You could import that and then scope your Ember concurrency task or whatever it is to that lifespan that you imported, and only that presenter knows how to provide that lifespan. I don't know. There could be a lot of problems with this idea, but that's where I'm leaning toward.
Interesting.
And
Very interesting.
There is kind of, I mean, a lot of the best ideas are not new. They're just reimagined things that already exist. And so they're already, like the UI navigation controller on iOS. I don't want to make you spend another like 4 hours just like looking back and forth on.
It might happen.
On the phone, but there is if you're on the contacts app and you tap someone's name, it goes into the sort of master detail page. And if you start to swipe back, you see that the thing that you tapped kind of fades in and out. Like it's parameterized to how far along the transition. So iOS gives you a way of opting into being like, I'm a view that's smart enough to handle these transition-y states and to handle that like percentage from 0 to 100% transitioned to decide how much the selected
to map
element
that to the
the
length.
And I can imagine a lifespan that also passes you a variable that's balanced. You can drive that
back
stuff.
How much, how far along in its lifespan it is.
Yeah, or you can even imagine maybe it doesn't even have to be in the sort of JS side of things. It'd be all in the template. Within lifespan, blah, and then you use that
as percent, and then
yeah.
Very interesting.
That's super cool.
Yeah, my mind's like racing now.
Well, and this goes back to what we talked to earlier. We're like giving people ways to experiment. It's like they can come up with lifespans and super cool.
Yeah. Cool. So that was a great conversation. We just want to wrap up. Some people you're like your fans. They just want to know. Actually, the first one wants to know when's the album coming out? When's your full album coming out? Anyone who follows you online is privy to your musical experiments. And
I don't know. I don't think my Twitter follower. I don't think people like my music.
Why do you say that?
I don't know. Because I'm
it's
vain.
conventional?
Because I'm vain and I'm pay attention to the likes, and if I post a little ditty I recorded, it's like 2 likes. Okay.
I think it's too conventional, your music.
Yeah, right.
Didn't you do the soundtrack for an EmberConf one year?
That's when I was speaking, I think. I remember him doing my Ben Gibbard cover.
I've done the music for the last 4 years, just progressively less and less effort.
But there was a year you played, like you
Yeah, you had a drum set. And
Yeah, I had a little drum pad, I had a guitar, and a keyboard. It was great for the ego.
we should do a server-driven Ember app that's a real-time band.
I think Gavin Joyce already did that. The EmberConf WebSocket-driven instrument playing.
That was just like 2 weeks ago, too.
Yeah.
If you could improve one thing with Ember, what would it be and why? I can guess your answer.
It's all the stuff we've been talking about.
The router stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's...
Making it more adaptable to...
I suppose. Yeah, it's all the stuff that I've been thinking about and working on.
Right. Do you have strategies for teaching Ember concurrency to someone who doesn't know about generator functions?
I don't know. I spent a lot of time on the documentation to really make the case for why the add-on exists and then how it really just behaves like a normal function until you add a yield. So I think maybe I would say that if you were going to show somebody, if someone gets scared, that's very disrespectful. If someone sees the generator function syntax and sees an asterisk and they don't know what it is, I think you can just say, well, just put it there for now and then write the code that you would normally put in action. And that'll just work. There's nothing about, it only does different things when you start using the yield keyword. And all the asterisk means is like you can use the yield keyword in this function.
Right.
So I would just...
It's a superset, and so you could ignore the additional functionality until you need it.
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, when I first uncovered generators, it was in like Ruby. And I remember being like, what is this? This is super confusing. And I saw an example of like a countdown and another one where it did like Fibonacci. And once I saw those with just like some real simple math, I was like, okay, this is like super easy. Even I can understand this.
Yeah, but the truth is the only time I ever use generator functions is Ember concurrency.
Yes.
All these like clever stateful ways of generating values is just, I don't know what the use case is.
Yeah, agree.
So
I think the use case is learning what a generator is, how it yields back control.
Right. I think Ember concurrency, when people take the time to like figure out like how does it work, and it just to think about how a task is really just a slice of these resumable portions. All you need to do is basically write the runner that knows how to take the promises emitted to it, wait for those, then send the resolve values back. It's like a cool problem. It's a fun problem to solve or to think about and put in your like computer science arsenal. But other than that, man, I really don't use generator functions at all.
Yeah, that's good to know. Are there some JavaScript patterns you don't see being used as often as you think that they should be?
We're going to talk about Ember concurrency again. I think there's a sort of tiers of people that get what I'm after with that API. Maybe the first use case is somebody rewrites something in a task so it gets cleaned up when the host object dies, the components is not as unrendered. And then the second tier is somebody uses the derived state to get rid of a like is running flag or is submitting flag and uses that. And then there's a lot of different levels where the further along you go, the more you're thinking about lifespans of like, how can I like sort of describe a span of things happening in here and sort of make a little tree of stuff that cleans up after itself. And it's hard to just get people thinking that way to get the more advanced use cases, but they're really powerful. And if you can think in that way, I think maybe if we formalized lifespans a little bit more, people would have a word or a concept to make them to slightly change the way they think about stuff.
Make them easier to identify in their apps.
Right, because everyone's really well trained of like, how do I clean up this mess I made? But if you can use the best data structure or whatever you want to call it, logical structure of whatever a lifespan is, to enforce the most rules by default, and that's much less for you to write. And so that's my own sort of selfish, self-aggrandizing thing that I want people to use more and more.
Right.
Think of things in terms of lifespans.
Interesting.
Using the thing with the most variance, most constraints.
It is true. I mean, when we give names to things, it helps us think about them more clearly. I remember when Ember first added services. Like, there used to be an Ember with no services, you know? But then we added services, and it was like, oh, okay, the current user, or whatever it is, right? That makes sense to put in a service.
Right.
And it helps you separate those things. You don't have a lot of them, but when you need them, they're there, and it's clear, you know, helps us talk about them and stuff.
Right.
Someone asked about if someone wanted to get more involved in the core team, or just kind of the deeper Ember community, the second layer.
Right.
What are some ways to bridge the gap between some basic contributions and the complicated RFC process? How do you drive community change from only add-on code?
I don't know. I don't think there's one way to do it. I think when you have a community, I mean, the core code base is so well guarded because so many people use it. It's really hard to land any sort of feature. I thought it was going to be really easy for me to like work on the name blocks RFC because I knew I wasn't going to be the one writing the Glimmer internals, but just coordinating with that many people and making my case and answering to all the criticism, it just takes so much time, and even getting it through like depended a lot on the sort of credentials I'd already built up with the community. I mean, there's so many. It's so easy for, I don't know. I basically recognize that a lot of people think it's really difficult to know where to start, and maybe they've had a bad experience of they submitted an RFC and it didn't take off or languished for a really long time, and then suddenly Ember Core team responded and said, we thought about it and we said no, sorry. Like, that is a crappy experience. And in some ways, there's probably some things I could change about how the core team like takes in this feedback. But at the same time, there's a really difficult problem of like people are trying to change this like really complicated piece of software that impacts lots of people, and knowing it's always going to involve a sort of like rapport, established credentials that the more you do, the easier it becomes. The more you're going to know, already have like made those connections with people that can echo your concerns and give you a lot of momentum. And I think there's something that's always going to be difficult about getting that kind of momentum. It's going to be really hard. And I experienced it myself and was very frustrated by it. And then it just gets better over time. So.
That's good. Are there decisions that you made when you were building Ember concurrency that, like, just decisions you made to make it like so well accepted and get high adoption?
Yes, because originally it was based on CSP, commutative sequential processes, whatever the thing that Golang's built on. I should know. No, I'm not going to try and correct myself. But you know, that basically makes you split things off into a channels primitive and then your Go routines, basically, that will block waiting for a value to be put into the channel, and then it can do its work and then, you know, fire something on a separate channel. Like, that's the most like Golang-ish, maybe. Even like the actor model kind of works that way, but with a different arrangement of the objects. But I knew that wasn't going to take off. I knew that if there's going to be a thing that people were going to kick off, it needed to be as close to a function as possible, that you call it and it immediately starts running, and not have to make people think about channels and routines and all this stuff. So there's times where I like I like dumb it down. I know this is really
if you were developing in isolation, you would have it differently than thinking about you're anticipating the fact that other people are going to use this who haven't been spending months reading these ridiculous papers that you've been reading. Right.
But the thing is, I can say it's dumbing it down, but it's much better that it is that way, the way that it landed, than if I were trying to impress a bunch of like functional programming dorks.
It's simpler. Which makes it easier to use and adopt.
No, and in fact, I'm sorry, it's easier, it's not simpler.
Oh, right.
If you're going
to
subscribe to the simple made easy mindset.
Simple made easy, yep.
It's super complected, but it's better because it's complected.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, that was a really fascinating discussion, and our guest today has been Alex Matchneer. Thanks for being a part of the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
All right.